Welcome, friends. Great to have you with us on the Case for Life program. Today, we're going to talk pro-life strategy, and I have a special guest that I think is uniquely qualified to discuss this. His name is Jojo Ruba. You may have heard of him from the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform and more recently, Students for Life of America. He is the go-to guy when you want to talk about thinking politically, thinking culturally, and how we integrate law and culture and where the public is in our efforts to legislate protecting unborn humans. Jojo, great to have you with us.
So glad to be with you, Scott.
Little background on you for those that may not know. You graduated from Carleton University with a degree in political science. And indeed, I think you wrote a dissertation, well, not a dissertation, but a graduate paper on political strategy. Am I right about that?
Yeah, so my master's degree paper was actually on the pro-life movement in Canada, where I'm from.
Right. Yeah, and I've had the pleasure of working with you up in Canada over the years, and we've got some stories to tell. We won't bore our audience with it today, but I wanted
Sure.
to bring you on today because there is a lot of noise in the pro-life sphere of things, and I call it noise. Some people fear the movement is splitting in two. I don't believe that. I believe there are some very loud voices that are a distraction more than a division, but it
Mhm.
has to do with how we ought to proceed politically and legally to protect unborn humans. Let me start by asking you a general question. As a Christian, what is our
Mhm.
duty politically?
Yeah, that's a great question because part of the challenge we have here is the people raising with their loud voices do so with a Christian tinge, right? They use a Christian worldview, but I think both practically and theologically they come with very deep problems, and I think those are the kinds of issues that are coming out because the pro life movement, as a movement as a whole, needs to be able to articulate why we do what we do in both spheres and to be able to understand both spheres well enough to explain that to the people who are our supporters or friends who may be swayed by these kinds of ideas. In terms of what our responsibility is, it really goes back to what Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 29 to the people of Jerusalem. I love that passage, not because of just the verse that everyone misquotes, the plans I have for you, that was for the Jews, but Jeremiah actually says a foundational political principle that Christians need to follow. And this is what he says to them. He says, I know you've just been conquered by the Babylonians. I know you hate their guts, and I know you're going to be in Babylon for 70 years. And this is what you need to do. You need to pray for the peace of your city, for as it prospers, so will you. And I think that message informs everything I do in politics because ultimately uh, our job as Christians is to be able to want the best for the people around us, to fight for the common good, and to be able to say the Christian values that we hold will actually benefit everybody if we actually know what they are and adhere to them. That does not mean creating a Christian theocratic state. It means being able to create a system where we are able to exchange ideas, we're able to find peaceful solutions to each other's problems, and to be able to say this is what a biblical worldview does. It allows for true tolerance and true democracy.
Now, one of the pushbacks I've gotten from some people promoting equal protection laws that tend to be immediatist and abolitionist is this: you just don't trust the power of the risen Jesus. Christians
Mhm.
have the power of the gospel, the power of miracles, the power of the risen Lord. The same resurrection power that raised Jesus from the dead can be ours to impact culture now. But you pro lifers just don't want equal protection for babies in the womb, and you won't use the power of the gospel that's available to you. What would be your response to that?
Well, when people raise those kinds of theological arguments, I simply ask them a question like this: do you have a lock on your front door? If you do, are you not trusting God to protect your house? Do you have a fire hydrant at your church? Well, if you do, are you not trusting God to protect your church? There's all kinds of practical realities that not only God allows for, He actually mandates in Scripture. There's all kinds of practical realities of how we run church. Right? The Bible talks about how we need to have an orderly service. Can God create an orderly service without us planning? Absolutely, but it's included there. When God tells Abraham to go to the promised land, there's a pathway he has to follow. When he takes the Israelites out of Egypt, there's incremental steps that he takes. When he gets Joshua to conquer the promised land, there's incremental steps where he starts in the south and goes to the north. So that application just seems odd, Scott, that we would apply that to the saving of babies, but not to anything else in the person's life. Because ultimately, this is not about whether or not we trust God. The question is, do we obey God? And God has told us in scripture to do good to those who are available, who are around us. And we do not hold back good to your neighbor if you could help that neighbor now. That's what Proverbs says. So to be able to have this kind of mindset that we're just going to trust God and that's going to be our political strategy, that's not honoring to God, because you're not using all the gifts, all the resources that you have, and the talents that God has given you to save as many as you can. And I think that's a theological cop out, which they themselves don't apply to anything else in their life.
It seems to me, too, there's a sense of playing poker chips with babies' lives in this regard. They are willing, the immediatists are, to sacrifice babies in the short term that could have been
Mhm.
saved with incremental legislation in hopes of an idealized future that may be decades away or may never show up. And I
Right.
can't wrap my mind around that why we would be willing to sacrifice children we could save now in hopes of an idealized future. In fact, one of the pushbacks we get from equal protection advocates is that pro-lifers are making babies wait for protection. Actually, it's just the other way around. They are
Mhm.
unwilling to sign on to bills that would protect babies now because they don't have provisions in them for punishing women for murder, or that would allow women to be punished for murder. So I think they're the ones making babies wait, not us.
Well, ultimately, the reason why I got into this discussion on abolitionism is because of what happened here in Canada, where we actually had a government willing to put abortion back in our criminal code, but it would only punish and criminalize late term abortions, and allow for gestational or health reasons, which are horrible. But the pro boards, who I look to in terms of is this the right thing to do, hated this bill because it would then allow the state to still prosecute abortions. Right. And rather than siding with the government to get this bill passed, the pro life political group here in Canada actually opposed it, and it was defeated by our unelected Senate. Scott, it wasn't elected officials, two unelected senators in the Senate helped defeat this bill. And for almost 39 years now, Canada has no fetal protections at all. We have to fund abortions, but at least three of the biggest provinces here don't even record or publicize the number of abortions they perform, how late those abortions are performed. And in terms of our political world, we have a situation where the one party that is open, that could be open to pro lifers, actually has a party platform that prevents them from talking about abortion. This is the result of abolitionism. And so that's why I actually like to call the abolitionists premature abolitionists, because they're trying to pass equal protection bills that will either be overturned by the courts or overturned by a legislature after that legislature, because it's not planned through or thought through. Whereas what we're actually advocating is permanent abolition. We want to be able to create a permanent abolition based on clear thinking strategies, electing pro life legislatures that are supported by pro life majorities in the public. That's the long term strategy. And that's the strategy that will save most babies as soon as possible.
Well, I have seen abolitionists push back and say the following: well, it's always the right thing to do. You don't worry about the right timing. You just do the right thing. And they'll cite historical examples that they think make their case. One abolitionist said to me, "Well, it was a small party of patriots that pushed for the American Revolution when the overwhelming majority of colonists in New England were opposed to revolution against England." Well, that's just false. The overwhelming majority of colonists supported war with England, and it was people like John Adams trying to restrain the zealots from moving too quickly that direction. But the support was there. The other line of argument I've heard is the early church fathers promoted legal prosecution for murder for women who had abortions. They did no such thing. They proposed ecclesiastical penalties. They did not propose legal prosecution for women who had abortions. And there's a tendency in their rush to get their point out to make some pretty sloppy mistakes historically,
Right.
and I think they need to be more careful in how they look at history.
Yeah, no, it's funny, both of those examples, as well as every other injustice that we have fought historically. When a civil rights group, a human rights group, Christians in particular have fought injustice.
Yep.
They've had to fight it incrementally. Not because God doesn't want the injustice to stop, but because God wants to use incremental steps in those cases. So, one example I like to use, God, is to simply ask someone who's a Christian. Most abolitionists are Christians of some sort. Why did God use 10 plagues to free the slaves in Egypt? Why didn't he use 5 or 3? And the scripture actually explains, because God wanted to show his glory and power over Egypt and the Egyptian gods, and God wanted the slaves, the Israelites, to trust him. And in the situation that we're in, there God can miraculously end abortion tomorrow. Would he, if he does that, will I support that? Absolutely. I'd love that. Right. And we want that, and we can pray for that. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to take care of our neighbors, as Proverbs said, to those who we can help. My brother was a medic in the military, the reservist here in Canada. And one of the key things you learn as a medic is this term called triage, that you are responsible for saving who you can at the moment you can. You are not morally responsible for a soldier who dies while you're trying to save one other soldier who's more likely to live, because it was the injury that killed that soldier, not you. And I imagine these abolitionists, Scott, screaming at these poor medics because they're not saving both soldiers, when the soldier himself is trying to dodge bullets, trying to not be shot himself while he's trying to rescue one of the soldiers. That's what these abolitionists are actually doing to pro-lifers.
Well, I
We're
think it's
doing
actually even worse than that. They blame us for the babies that die that we were never in a position to save in the first place. And they say
correct. Yeah,
that when we support a bill that doesn't protect all unborn life, we are consenting to the lives of those we failed to protect, that we're
yeah,
consenting to their death. But I don't find that persuasive at all. And I like to use the example of the Bataan Death March in the early
mhm,
1940s in the
mhm,
Philippines. The
yeah,
Philippines fall to the Japanese. The American army is trapped there. They're taken prisoner by the Japanese, and they're sent on an 86-mile death march in the stifling heat and humidity. And suppose I'm one of those American officers that has been captured. And let's take it further. This is exactly what happened. As men would drop off, the Japanese would just shoot them. Well,
right.
suppose I was able to secure a concession from my Japanese captors, and I was able to say to them, look, give me 10 minutes to get the men up and moving again before you shoot them. Now, suppose I'm able to save 400 men by getting them up and going again, and me and other fellow officers dash up and down the line getting men moving who have collapsed. We managed to save 400, but 500 men get shot. Did we consent to their deaths? No, not at
Yeah,
all. An evil situation was imposed on us, and we
right.
were not in a pardon me, a position to save all of the men, but we were in a position to save some. And those are the
Mhm.
ones we're morally accountable to, not the ones we never were in a position to
Well,
save.
let me add something else. My grandparents were actually in the Philippines during the Japanese
Wow.
occupation, and they were being bombed. They had a 5-month-old baby. My uncle, who actually didn't survive the war, probably because of the stress, and their village was being bombed by the Japanese, the civilian built village in the middle of the mountains. No military buildings nearby. They were just being bombed because they were Filipinos. And this is how I use that analogy as well, because it's similar to what you said with the death march. The Allies actually, during World War II, decided to focus all their energy in fighting the Nazis in Europe and contain the Japanese instead. Now, that sucks for those of like my family who had to endure the Japanese occupation much longer. Many of them died because they had to wait. But that was not a moral decision about the value of the Asians and the Americans who were POWs in Asia. That was a strategic military decision that allowed them to end the war faster. So there was no moral judgment against Asians versus Europeans. This was the best way to stop this world war is to start with Europe and then focus on Japan.
Well,
And
we
and
all have an equal right to life. We may not have an equal right to be rescued at the time we want to be rescued.
Right. And so that's why these equal protection bills are misnamed or misnomer,
Yep.
because absolutely we agree with equal protection. The challenge is we don't live in a culture that does. So just like with triage, just like your example with the death march, just like what happened with my grandparents, this has nothing to do with their values, everything to do with the practical reality of the evil world we live in.
Now the pushback will be you're just being a pragmatist, Ruba.
Yes.
You're engaging in evil pragmatism instead of biblically engaging the issue. How do we reply to people who want to demagogue this issue by pretending they're the spiritual ones with biblical foundation while the rest of us are just evil pragmatists?
Well, it's hard to reach people who are self-righteous, and frankly, that remind me a lot of pro-abortion activists or LGBT activists who refuse to talk to us just because we have a different perspective, and especially if you have sort of a network of people who affirm you and you never actually engage people who disagree with you, that's going to be hard. But what I would like to do is focus on the low-hanging fruits and be able to talk to those who are still open and still having a conversation and challenge their understanding. So in terms of practicality or pragmatists, I would ask them this, and I credit one of my Christian friends with this the other day. Why did Jesus say God allowed Moses to include divorce in the Mosaic law? Not because God endorses divorce. Jesus clearly says, I hate divorce. But he says, because of your evil nature, God understands and allowed for divorce to exist in the Mosaic law because God understands our nature. It's not evil for him to do that unless they want to argue that. But God himself takes pragmatic steps, is my point. And the pragmatic steps is living in the reality that we live in. When we look at what happened in the Exodus, God actually tells Moses to go and ask Pharaoh for time to sacrifice in the deserts
3 days journey.
before.
Yep.
That's right, and he says he's not gonna listen to you, but I want you to do that anyway. Why would God do that? That's an incremental step. Why didn't he just snap his finger and end slavery? Because he could have.
Right.
Because again, there's purposes for the increments. And I think those who argue that we're at fault for demanding incrementalism or that we're using incrementalism need to understand, look, we want to abolish abortion too. But in order for us to have a permanent abolition, we need to be able to go back to the reality of where we live in and not in the fantasy world that they live in. Unless God is willing to miraculously intervene, we have a job to do.
We're going to take a short break, Jojo. When we come back, I want to give you this question. Are these equal protection law bills actually going to save lives or put more babies at risk? I'd like to get your thoughts on that. We'll take that up after the break, folks. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, everyone. Here with my friend and colleague Jojo Ruba, who I believe is one of the best content specialists on the integration of politics and culture. Jojo, before the break, I tossed an issue out to you. There's a question you put out that I borrow from you because I find it very effective. And you have taught me to ask this question when talking with immediatists and abolitionists. If I could show you that equal protection bills actually might result in the death of more children rather than saving more children, would you be at least willing to hear what I have to say? How would you answer that question?
Well, if I was an honest abolitionist or wavering, obviously I'd say, yeah, of course I should be willing to listen, because ultimately, if they are true abolitionists, their goal is to end the killing of babies. And that should be our primary goal as the pro-life movement. And so we need to follow which methodology saves the most babies. I can testify here in Canada that because the pro life movement, the political arm of the pro life movement, adopted an abolitionist ideology, we have no abortion laws. Abortion is publicly funded, and more babies are being killed today because of the strategies that we chose as a movement here in Canada. And that will be the same case in the US. One other thing as well that people don't think about is the abolitionist strategy is they want to keep bringing up laws that abolish abortion, provide equal protection immediately without thinking through what are the results of that. So, for example, a guy debated who was an abolitionist who said, yes, we need to pass equal protection immediately. When I asked him, well, in your state, you actually have third party self defense laws where you can actually shoot someone who you think is going to be harming someone else. Would you, as an abolitionist, have a right to shoot abortion doctors as soon as an abolitionist bill is passed? And he said, yes. And I don't think most of those state legislators are actually thinking about that. Or how about this? That anyone who advocates for abortion would be advocating for death threats or be committing death threats. Well, that means all the pro-abortion politicians should also be arrested. Or how about this? Every woman who's had an abortion or will have an abortion, every man who's been involved with that, if their laws are retroactive, would actually have to be arrested. And do they have enough budget and money to arrest all of those people? Is that really what we want to do? Is
Well,
focusing
and
on
then you
arresting
throw
who?
in the chemical abortion reality we
Abs-
face now. Here's the problem. We're looking at 80% almost of abortions now being chemical abortions. How do you
Correct.
enforce a murder prosecution when natural miscarriage presents exactly the same way medically as taking
Mhm.
these abortion drugs? You can't
Right.
trace the drugs in the body of the woman. You got to find the kid who's been
Right.
flushed down the toilet by this point. So the enforceability here is going to be very difficult. I'm not saying there should be no consequences for having an abortion, but I'm not sure we've thoroughly thought through what our strategy looks like. And I love the way you frame this. You want a permanent abolition where
Correct.
we don't want to rush out in front too early. I mean, I can think of all kinds of examples militarily where this was done. Dan
Right.
Sickles at Gettysburg, who went out in front of the main
Absolutely.
Union line in the Peach Orchard and got annihilated and nearly
Mhm.
cost the Union Army its position on
Right.
Cemetery Ridge. And as a result of that foolish move, it was only the heroics of the 1st Minnesota that saved the day that day. Well,
Yeah.
we shouldn't be doing foolish stuff. We need to be thoughtful and prudent. Of course, the pushback is, again, we're just being biblical. We don't care what the consequences are. But I think we do have to care what the consequences are. And I think we see examples of prudence in every successful social reform movement we've looked at. You see it
Yeah.
in Wilberforce, who pulled back his general abolition bills between 1800 and 1805 repeatedly because it was not a good time to introduce them. The public sentiment was turning against the abolitionists because of the war with France. And then you see
Mhm.
what Lincoln did. Lincoln understood he didn't even have abolition support in the North. There was no stomach for a war to free the slaves
Right.
in 1860.
Yeah.
Lincoln had to work prudently, very carefully to build that support, and no less an abolitionist than Frederick Douglass credited Lincoln with freeing the slaves, not with rash, quick, irresponsible movements, but by very carefully, and in some
Mhm.
ways frustratingly to the abolitionists, plotting
Mhm.
his steps so that he could bring about a lasting abolition.
Yeah, and that's why I like the dichotomy of premature abolitionism, which is haphazard, not well thought through. It's all about the self-righteousness of the person
Right.
rather than thinking strategically about how can we make this change permanent. What's interesting is, yes, all these civil rights movements, whether it's anti-slavery, abolition, or even World War II, required not just strategic steps, but there were people within their movements who were, let's just say, the zealots. Just like Jesus dealt with zealots of his day who wanted to overthrow Rome and somehow rule Jerusalem as this little city in this thousands of kilometers of Roman Empire that they could hold back. And that's how I envision what the abolitionists are trying to do here. Their theology, everything matches that zealotry that people like Malcolm X and others used in the past. And what's interesting is the zealots are never the ones who accomplish the task. It's always the people who are incrementalists who are planning. the planning for the permanent abolition, right? We're the ones who actually get it done. The zealots sometimes cause even more problems. And this is why I say, like, they actually will result in more dead babies, because the zealots of Jesus' day were so keen on overthrowing the injustice of the Roman Empire. They actually succeeded for like what, 5 years, 6 years, and then they got wiped out. The temple got destroyed. They got crucified or enslaved, and it held back the people of Jerusalem for decades after that. And that's what's happened here in Canada when it comes to abortion, Scott. That's why I'm so passionate about this, for my American friends to not make the same mistake we did, because you will see the results of what abolitionism does by looking at what happened here in Canada.
Well, look at what we're facing here in the state, or in the states. We have deeply red states, Ohio, Missouri, Kentucky, and others that are writing abortion rights into their state constitutions. And
Right.
even when abolitionists and pro-lifers joined together to oppose those measures, we still lost. That tells me a couple of things. Number one, we're not as strong as we think we are. So there's a real world necessity we have to contend with. But secondly, not only are we not as strong as we need to be, these equal protection bills feed the narrative that is defeating these efforts to stop these state measures. Because what is
Right.
the pro-abortion side arguing? Oh, if we don't pass this, women are going to get jailed. They're not going to get the medical care they need. They could be
Mhm.
put behind bars. This will protect women. And here we are leading at this moment with bills that say, yeah, let's prosecute women for murder. This is just nonsense to me, and the timing could not be worse. And I think what equal protection advocates are failing to realize is every state that writes abortion rights into its state constitution is a state where an equal protection bill is dead on arrival and has even more hurdles to overcome than it does now. Why would you
Yeah.
do something that puts at jeopardy our ability to stop these state measures, which is
Mhm.
the strategy of the other side? Jojo, they planned this for decades, that if Roe
Yes.
were ever overturned, the strategy would be to get ballot initiatives going that write abortion into the state constitutions. Pro-lifers were all looking at Roe v. Wade federally. The pro-aborts were thinking statewide on what to
Mhm.
do. Well, we're about out of time. We've got about 20 seconds left. Any parting thoughts?
You know what's really powerful is Jesus invited one of the zealots, Simon, to be one of his disciples, and gave him better tools to harness his passion to fight injustice, and that's the gospel. And I think we need to be able to go back to that, to say the culture we live in needs us to be good neighbors, because that's how we share good news. And if we don't do that because we're too self-righteous to think this is the only way, our way is the only way, then we aren't loving our neighbors the way God commands us to do.
That is a great thought. Thank you, Jojo, for being with us. Everybody, I look forward to seeing you on the next show. If you have not had a chance to look at our site and see our course that's there, please take a look at that. It'll equip you to make a difference for life. Till next time.